Hello, hi, Assalamualaikum. We are covering on the first content of our course, which is System Development Overview. For this slide, which is part one, we will be covering the first top three, which is definition of system analysis and design. And then we take a look at two approaches. First one is structured approach, and the second one is object-oriented approach. I believe most of you have been taken programming 1 and programming 2. I think by now you are very familiar with the object-oriented concept, and the last content will be covered in part 2. Okay, as this course is about system analysis and design, let me just brief you what you will be learning throughout this course, which is to get system analysis skill. Okay, what is it about? This is actually a process of defining a problem related to the system that you are going to build. And partly your job as a system analyst is actually gathering the requirement. So you are basically trying to figure out what are the functions that the system must have. Okay, and after you have defining the problem and also know what are the requirements or the functionality of the system, your next job is to come up with an analysis model that represent this requirement. Okay, you can actually capture all this information in terms of text. Okay, but nowadays we normally represent this information in the form of a model, of a diagram. Okay, so that this information can be shared among other people. Okay, let's say if you write it in all this information in Bahasa Melayu, for example, you can only be read by those who know Malay. Okay, whereby if you represent this in terms of model, even computer can process it. Even those from other languages, people talking in other languages can still understand it. Okay. All right. So, when you are doing system analysis, okay, partly the job that you have to do in system analysis is to define a problem. What that means is, whenever you are trying to come up with a software for the first time, you actually have to know what is the current problem of the system. Sometimes there is no system at all. Okay? Maybe they are actually writing the information of, for example, purchase transaction only in their book, a logbook. Okay, so that they don't have any system. So your job is to find what are the current situation that they are having and what is the current problem that the user is having. So from there, you try to help them to propose a system. Okay. So the goal of you doing system analysis is to state accurately what the user's requirements are, meaning that what are the functions of the systems that your user actually wants from or for the new information processing system that they are trying to have. Moving on to the second definition, which is system design. Okay, this course is about analysis and design. So there are two big processes that you'll be covering in this course. Okay, design is basically also related to a process by which the analysis model is transformed into a model which is capable of being implemented. Remember, when you are doing system analysis, one of the process that you are going to do is to come up with a model or a diagram. Okay, so during design phase, what you are trying to do, you use that model and then you convert it in a form which is detailed enough to be converted into a program so that it can be implemented so that it can be run, right? So by now, when you are doing system design, you are actually trying to describe the solution to the problem. You describe how you can actually handle all the problems that you define in the system analysis so that that problem can be solved, right? So the goal of doing system design is first is to get satisfaction of the requirement, meaning that you want to satisfy all the functions that the system should have. For example, if you are taking in an example of mobile banking, for example, so you want a secure system. So during design, you try to design a secure solution, right? And then you want to have uh, an effective function. You want the functions that you specify in the requirement can be done. Okay, maybe if you have specified in terms of performance, you want, because basically when you use a system, you want to make the task faster, right? So it should be faster compared to when you are doing it manually, when you write it on your book. Okay, and then you should specify, it should be constructability, meaning that what at this point of time, when you design it, it can be done. You can actually build it. Okay, and then you want it at this point of time, you want to design an efficient design process. Okay, so efficient means that the process that you design should actually save time and cost, right? So now that you have some idea what is analysis and design, so what is the purpose of having or learning about analysis and design? First of all, you want to add formality, meaning that when you are developing software, normally you have to follow certain processes. That process is not actually followed by you. It's actually followed by all system analysts, all system designer. Okay, so you want to make this process more structured, okay, more systematic, and of course, partly doing analysis and design is that you want to improve communication between the participants. Okay, so you want to make sure that you have communicate with the user in a very clear way. You get to know what the users want, and then you perform analysis and design, then you show it back to the user to confirm that this is what the users want. Okay, and then to get the requirement right. So you basically want to make sure that you are developing the system that has the requirement that is satisfied by the user. And by doing that, you are trying to reduce error, meaning that you are developing something that what the users want. For example, you as a user, for example, you want uh, system analyst to create you to design you a system. Of course, you want to make sure that at the end of the day, you have the system that is meeting what you want, right? And the last purpose of doing analysis and design is that when basically when you do analysis and design, you come up with a documentation. You actually report it down. Okay, you record the diagram, you record what the users want. So all those are documented. Okay, when you have that document, you record it, and then you can actually discuss it with the user to get the approval. Okay, so you don't actually just talk verbally, because at the end of the day, people forget. So when you have this analysis and design and you actually document it in the form of model and diagrams, so what has been discussed is recorded. So it can be an agreement between the software house and the user. All right. Now that you know the definition of analysis and design and the reason of doing it, this slide is basically showing the course that you can save by performing analysis and design. Okay, so um, basically what happened here is it shows um, if you actually trying or if you perform analysis and design earlier, you can actually detect the error earlier. Okay, when you know the okay, when you are learning about analysis and design, there are several approaches that you can follow. Okay, basically there are two approaches. The first one is structured approach, and the second one is object-oriented approach. Okay, the one that you've been using in programming 1 and 2 is actually object-oriented approach. But the structured approach is slightly an older approach. Even though it's old, there are some companies who are still using it. So even though you're not going to use it in this course, I will explain it a bit so that whenever you will see that diagram, then you know, oh, that is actually structured approach. Okay. In this structured approach, basically they use the main diagrams is called DFD and ERD. I think when you learn about, you will take database courses, you'll be using ERD. Okay. Entity relationship diagram. And DFD is for data flow diagrams. Okay, data flow diagrams is a diagram where you use it to capture information about the process. Okay, you're capturing the processes that happen in that system. Whereby if you are using ERD, you are trying to capture the data that you'll be using for that system. Right? And when you are using structured approach, you are actually the way that you use it, the information that you are trying to capture is more related to the process. Okay, so for example, um, when you have that when you are trying to design for a system, you are looking at that system, thinking about what are the processes that involve. Okay, all right. So this is how DFD looks like. Okay, DFD is basically showing the processes. Process 1, for example, process inquiry. Process 2 is actually processing the order. And along the way, it will show to you what are the data that is involved. For example, process order is actually using customer information, item information, and also order. And then um, it's showing who are the user, customer, right? So DFT basically is showing the process, and this diagram can show at a different level of detailness. Okay, so for example, process 1, you can actually create a more detailed process for one process, and then another one you can have it for another process. You can have a detail level, a more detailed information about the process that is related for this particular process. Okay. This one is another one which is called ERD, and basically it's actually representing the data that you'll be using for that system. For example, I believe this is hospital information, patient, doctor, ward, and assistant, and it's showing the relationship between them. Okay, if you see ERD and DFT, so you can have an idea that this actually a structured approach in doing analysis and design. All right. So the second approach is actually called object-oriented approach. All right. This is very much to what you have been doing in programming 1 and 2. It's just that when you are doing programming 1 and 2, you only experience the skills in programming. Okay. So what you actually have to do in the real world is to do analysis and design first, then followed by programming. Okay, So object-oriented approach is actually data-centric. The structured approach, as I mentioned just now, is actually process-centric. All right. So remember when you are doing your classes, you are basically creating objects. Yeah. For example, student objects, and then inside it you identify what are the attributes, right? And after that you define the methods for that particular class, right? But but the way that you design the system is basically thinking into account what are the data that you're going to use, right? And then object-oriented approach is said to be event-driven. Okay, I think you remember when you learn your in programming 2, you learn about GUI. Remember where you have events, you have to handle different events when you click on the text field, when you click on the button, right? So that is actually event driven. So it's very related to object oriented approach, right? And and when you are doing object oriented, you normally will do the analysis and design in the iterative manner, meaning that you keep on repeating it, doing it. Okay, maybe you do it for the first time and then followed by the second time. Okay, you keep on refining it, and then um, and then you've been developing it in terms of the objects, right? And then when you do object oriented, it's basically about the collections of objects, right? You normally don't only develop one object, you have several, okay, which will be called each other in order to accomplish certain tasks. All right, so whenever you do object oriented analysis and design, okay, so I think you have experienced this when you are doing your programming. You have to define what are the objects that you want to work with, right? And then you normally call one class to another class, right? So that is basically about object interactions. So in this course, you are basically going to do that, meaning that you'll be trying to identify what are the objects, and you will um, actually identify how that object will call another object without doing any programming yet. Okay, you are only designing it, only doing analysis. And after that, when you already know what are the objects, you will make it into more detail uh, in a way that you will refine it so that it is detailed enough to be implemented. Okay, um, so now we are going to look at the difference between these two approaches. Okay, the first one, which is object oriented. So this approach is basically trying to model the world as it is, meaning that, you know, when you are doing a system for students, you are trying the objects is actually students. Okay, in that student object, you define the data, and then the 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 methods, the behavior that objects have. So that is actually trying to model the world, and then it will using simulation based modeling. Okay, and then for the other one, which is structured approach, the concept, this approach is basically focusing on the processes, on the functions. Okay, and the focus is more on getting the solution. You want to model the solution. All right. Another difference between object and structured approach is that in terms of the way that they divide the problems. Okay, object-oriented will be using the object concept that you've been learning before, which is called encapsulation, information hiding, abstraction, whereby for structured approach, it can only achieve encapsulation. and information hiding through discipline. Okay, so structured approach actually also still implementing the concept of encapsulation, right, and information hiding, but not abstraction. And then in object-oriented approach later on, you will be creating several diagrams. I think more, quite a lot of diagrams. So because they try to have different diagrams to represent certain information. Okay, so you'll be using a diagram which is called use cases, and you'll be having a diagram to show the class. Okay, I think maybe when you are doing programming 1 and programming 2, you've been using the class diagram already, right? And then later on, this diagram will be refined, meaning that it will make into more detail by identify abstract class. Okay, what are the user interface needed? What are the data manager needed later on?